So Elizabeth, would you like to introduce our speaker?
Sure. Thank y'all for being here, and big thanks to David Hubbell. I am from New Orleans, so I became interested in Mirliton is how I say it. And we always had them at Thanksgiving around our house. Several years ago, somebody gave me a bunch of plants. I planted them. They did a little bit, but not a lot. They had been successful in Pensacola, and I think that I probably got rid of them too early. And then last year, I got a bunch of them and the rats took them. So the rats have been around for a while. And then I also got a chayote, and I call it the chayote because Diana gave that to me, and it came from the grocery store. So we just assumed that it came from South America. I was pleasantly surprised when I got some, and then I went and bought some more. And so there's a whole great Mirliton group from New Orleans and Mobile, and David, finding his Facebook page was like, it gave me hope. It gave me incentive. And truthfully, I probably would have knocked all of mine out had I not seen that his were starting to come in October and November. So then I realized that even though I did always have them around November, it just didn't register that they wouldn't be coming in all summer. So he's got a great website. There's a great group, a Mirliton group that he'll tell you about, but I'll just turn it over to him now. So David Hubbell.
Oh, thank you very much. I hope everybody can hear me. If I need to speak a little louder, just let me know. But I'm going to go ahead and put together a little presentation, hopefully to answer all of the questions, or maybe not all the questions, but at least educate people who aren't quite as familiar with Mirliton. As Elizabeth kind of alluded to, I'm living in Mobile, Alabama, but my family's originally from Louisiana. So I've got a history of Louisiana food and culture. And I'll kind of touch on that in my talk a little bit. So I put together a PowerPoint, and I've tried to include as many pictures, facts, and places where you can go get information after the meeting if you're still interested in learning about growing Mirliton. So I'm gonna go ahead and get into the presentation. And let me know if you can see it. Okay, is everybody able to see the PowerPoint?
Yeah, it looks good.
Okay. And I think what Renee was talking about is that we were just going to kind of hold questions or send them in the chat, and Elizabeth will record them. But if there's just something that's stopping the presentation from really going smoothly, go ahead and interrupt. But so I titled this Growing Mirliton Along the Gulf Coast. First of all, I don't know if I can see everybody's hands, but how many people have heard of Mirliton or chayote squash or a vegetable pear? Okay, of the folks that I can see, about half of them. How many of you have ever tried growing the Mirliton, chayote squash, or vegetable pear? Okay, about the same amount that I can see. So the goals of my talk is to introduce you to what a Mirliton is, if you're not familiar with it. If you are familiar with it, to reacquaint you with some of the intricacies of growing it. And as well as give you some resources on how to grow it, and as well as how to cook them. So as I mentioned, my ancestry is about, I come from the German Acadian coast, or my ancestors do. That was the area between Baton Rouge and New Orleans. A lot of German settlers originated or settled in Louisiana in the 1720s. And so this area just north of New Orleans in St. Charles Parish is known as the German coast. And those early German settlers were known for their gardening and farming prowess. And in fact, they were able to feed the young city of New Orleans on at least 2 occasions and keep them from starvation in the 1720s. So I've got a long line of agricultural people in my background. Growing up, my grandparents lived in Metairie, Louisiana, and my parents moved around from Texas to Mobile. And in all the cases, we had gardens or yards that were, fairly nicely rural manicured yards, but there was always vegetables or fruit trees growing. So I had an interest when I got into my first house about trying to grow a garden and plant one. And so we got a house that had established yards, and I had a previous vegetable garden here, or the owner did. So I started with, big box store type things, cucumbers, tomatoes, squash, eggplant, and beans, but I always felt like there was something missing. So as I started looking back and reflecting on what I really wanted to do with my garden, I kind of look back on my passions of, like I said, I've already told you about my interest in my ancestry. But also I enjoy eating, and my mom's a good Louisiana cook. So I always had an interest in cooking the dishes of South Louisiana. And as I started to explore these recipes, what I would find is that there's certain ingredients, while they were similar, I could never find them in the Winn-Dixies or Delchamps here in Mobile. And that's, to me, when I realized there are certain heirloom vegetables that weren't available. And that's the thing to me that was really missing. And that's when I decided that I wanted to try to grow traditional heirloom varieties that were found in my family's yard and garden in the New Orleans area in the river parishes. So luckily, as most of you know, the climate and the growing conditions between Mobile and even Pensacola are quite similar to that in New Orleans. So that gave me some hope that I could at least get as many of the same varieties as possible. And even though things aren't quite as subtropical here, I was still able to locate a number of seeds that I was either able to buy or trade. So I tried things such as Creole tomatoes, which there's a whole other story about those, but Creole tomatoes, an heirloom green eggplant that my family's been growing for 30 or 40 years, Tabasco peppers, which I make a pepper jelly with, something called Chack Bay peas, which is a very small southern pea, sugarcane, which is what a lot of my family raised in those river parishes, and then the Mirliton. So that, if you hadn't seen one, or maybe you've seen it but you didn't realize that's what it was, that's what we call Mirliton. All right. So what is it? Well, it's part of the cucumber family, and it's closely related to squash, cucumbers, and zucchini. And in some cases, it's prone to many of those same diseases and pests. But the thing is, it does also tend to be a little more tolerant than some of the summer squashes that you'd see. The species name, I hope not to destroy it too much, is Sechum edule. I took Latin 30 years ago, so it's probably a little rusty. But the common names you might hear are things as chayote, vegetable pear, Christophine, chut, choco, and there's actually, I think, like 60 plus names that have been listed on one of the sources I'll give you to describe a Mirliton. And they're actually grown throughout the world, the varieties are, but the ones that are really popular in the New Orleans area do well for zones 8B to 11 and the warmer parts of zone 8. So Pensacola being 9A and Mobile being 8B, we're in a good location to grow these heirloom Mirliton. So what do they look like? Well, you saw one just now, and it was light green, but they also come in dark green or ivory, and they vary in size. They're pear-shaped, and some of them have a long pear, kind of 4 to 6 inches long, and some of them are more short and squat, and they can either be smooth skin or have ridges and even spikes. And they can be about 3 to 4 inches at the base. So let's see, make sure I'm going in the right direction. So this is one that I grow. It's an heirloom. They vary in size from about 1/2 pound to 1.25 pounds. So that's a light green one. You can see the deep furrows along there. That's freshly picked. This would be a store-bought chayote, and same family. It's just a different variety, but you can see it's a lot smoother, but it's got the same similar features. This is the same as the one on the left, but it's a little older. And as it gets older, it starts to get these little crevices, or kind of like age spots, I guess. And then you see this one here that be a little brighter green. There's some even darker green than this, and they're very spiky. And then the really rare ones you might find are this ivory white Mirliton with very deep furrows. And I'll talk a little bit more about this one in detail. So as we talked about, it's very similar to the cucumbers and the squash. And so it's a vining plant, and the vines can start off at about 30 foot long, and they can get as long as 100 feet. It's a perennial. And so if you're lucky and you avoid a hard freeze, it'll come back every year. And the first year, you'll end up producing a small crop. Now, they're photoperiodic, and so you really don't start seeing flowering come on until the fall. And when that happens, they'll produce fruit from mid-October to early December, up until the first frost. And they can produce anywhere from, one vine can do 50 to 100 fruit in the fall. And then if you get an established vine, comes back in the spring, and you had a mild enough winter, you might actually get about 30 or 40 in anywhere from April to May. And I've read in the sources that if you had a very well-established vine that had the right growing conditions, enough water, sunlight, and shade, you could actually get up to 300 fruit per plant. I've never experienced that myself, but that's quite an accomplishment. So here's some pictures of what the vine looks like, and it's behind me if you're checking me out on the screen. It's very bushy, not bushy, but it grows, and it's got very heavy leaves. You can see the young fruit there. This trellis I've built here is about 24 foot long, 8 foot high, and about 7 foot wide. And despite my best efforts to grow it on the trellis, it's jumped over to my orange trees behind it. So it takes up a lot of room, but you get a pretty high yield. This is from one picking last year. And this is just another close-up of what the leaves look like, kind of heart-shaped, little pointy. My particular variety is, and about the size of a adult hand, a little bit bigger actually. Nutritionally, they're very low in calories. They're a good source of B complex vitamins, moderate source of potassium, and they're an adequate source of antioxidant vitamin C. People often ask, what do they taste like? And that's kind of hard to describe because they're not really overbearing in their flavor. Some will say it's slightly sweet. It's got a firm flesh, kind of like an apple or a pear, but it's not quite as sweet, and it's not tart. So I always kind of describe it as slightly like a squash or cucumber, but a lot more subtle. Some have described it as having sort of an insipid taste, or basically tasteless. But what it's often paired with in South Louisiana is with shrimp, crab meat, ground beef, ground pork, or some smoked meats or ham. So you can see it's pretty versatile from the standpoint if you're going to mix it with meat or seafood. And it oftentimes it's even just served by itself as a total vegetable, a vegetarian type of entree. And those of you who may be curious or may have already kind of gathered, where did it come from? Our best sources is that, like a lot of I guess from the Columbian Exchange, these were Mesoamerican and Caribbean in origin. And they arrived in the Gulf Coast, or in Louisiana, probably is where they originated and spread throughout the Gulf Coast. The history really kind of tells us you got several different couriers that brought them in: the French, the Spanish, and the English colonists. And then there's also a lot of claims that maybe the Canary Islanders brought some in with them when they settled through the Spanish. But through the work of this group that Elizabeth was talking about, it's called Mirliton.org, which I'll tell you a little bit more about in a minute. They pretty much have a theory that there's a strong tie between the Haitians settling in Louisiana and the Mirliton that are popular in this area. So there was 15,000 to 20,000 Haitian refugees that settled in the Louisiana and particularly the New Orleans area between 1789 to 1805. And that was the time of the Revolution and the Slave Rebellion. And Mirliton was a staple of the Haitian diet. And there's only two areas of the world that it's noted that Mirliton is, or it's called Mirliton, and that's Haiti and Louisiana. as you've probably kind of guessed, it's kind of got a strong, as many things in South Louisiana are, that's got a lot of culinary importance. It was noted in journals from 1847 that people were serving it on the banks of the Mississippi in the Point Coupé area parishes. They were seen at state fairs in the 1860s under the title of vegetable pear. And they were a very popular staple, probably more along the class, along the tables of the less than wealthy, the poorer people. Kind of like crawfish, if you've are a little older and have any familiarity with South Louisiana, crawfish really didn't become a very popular thing until the late 60s, and really the early 80s or mid 80s is when it really took off throughout the region. But Mirliton is sort of that same way. It's a local favorite, but it didn't really get a whole lot of notoriety. Looking at newspapers from that time period, you'll see that there's mentions of it in the 1870s and 1880s between Baton Rouge and New Orleans. And in the early 20th centuries, papers like the Times-Picayune would list advertisements for selling it, as well as they always did like weekly menus. And oftentimes you'd find in the fall, they're either contest on coming up with Mirliton recipes or giving the housewives of the day an idea of certain recipes that they might want to put on their menu. So it's been a great food source for Louisiana. And the New Orleans area tends to have, being a heavy Catholic influence, you often had large families there with a lot of mouths to feed. And as they started migrating into the city, property wasn't as plentiful as out in the country, but even though the Mirliton vine will run, it bears a lot of fruit for that vine. So I think especially during the Great Depression and even up through World War II, it was kind of a great backyard crop to have and to sustain the family. And especially around the fall season, as we talked about, when it's really in full production, you'll find it on the Thanksgiving tables in the form of Mirliton casserole or stuffed Mirliton, as well as at Christmas time. So it's got a kind of a nostalgic note about it as well for a lot of the older New Orleanians. My own particular story about it is that I do remember it as a kid, even though we didn't grow up in New Orleans. I do remember hearing about it when I was 4 or 5 and also thinking, well, it's green and I probably don't want to eat it. But my mom tried to grow it one time when we were living in Texas and didn't have a lot of success. So when I reached the point of growing, deciding I wanted to try my hand at it, I looked around. LSU Ag Center had a little information in a pamphlet, but it ended up, telling me how to root it, but it didn't tell me where to get it. And the best I could do was find some of the chayote at a Walmart. And so I looked at it and I found ones that looked similar to what was shown on websites or on from memory of what I thought it should look classically shaped and size. So I was trying to get as close to that variety as possible. So I got it to root. I planted it. I got a beautiful vine. I got some flowers around November, and actually had one walnut size Mirliton that came on the vine. And I could see it out my back door, a garage, and I was going to do something at my parents' house on Black Friday. I walked out the door and I couldn't see my Mirliton hanging there. And I went up and I saw it there lying on the ground, and I found it had 2 little teeth marks in it and that a squirrel had gotten to it. So I was obviously very disappointed. It was late November and the frost was coming. So the plant died, and I did not, even though I tried to do my best efforts to keep it alive, I never got any fruit off of it. So I started digging a little bit more and I found Mirliton.org. And it was in its inception at that point, and this was around 2009. And they referenced that they had emphasized that you really need an heirloom variety. And so I was scratching my head as to where I could get an heirloom variety. And one of my uncles over in Metairie, he mentioned that my grandfather's friend from back in the 1930s, who was still around at that time, had been growing Mirliton since the 1950s and 60s. And he acquired 6 of them from him to bring to us in Mobile. And of those 6, we actually got 1 planted at my father's house in Fairhope. And that, I'll show you some pictures from that. But from that first harvest, we actually ended up with 85 milliton. And from that, I was able to start a new vine in Mobile. Oops. So these are some of the pictures from back then. And you can see that he didn't really have it trellised or anything, but I called him up, asked him how the vine was doing. There's probably about 10 or 12 milliton out there. So I went out right in early December because we knew the frost was coming, to help them pick one day. And we ended up with a 5-gallon bucket plus some from that first harvest. And when we cleaned it all up, we ended up with 65 that one picking, and then he ended up with another 20 after that. So, we were astounded. And then the next thing was, what the heck we're going to do with all these milliton? So it was a good problem to have. But of these, I started 2 and planted them in my yard in Mobile, of which one is still surviving today, 11 years later.
Wow.
So I know it's covered a lot, but to just kind of bring you up to what we've learned over time between myself as well as the Mirliton.org, is that there's some tips to really being successful at growing milliton. And the first one is really to get a Louisiana heirloom. We call it Louisiana heirlooms, even though they weren't native to Louisiana, but they're the ones that have adapted and been grown probably since the early 1800s, that we believe came through with the Haitians or some of the other groups that were probably closer from the Caribbean to South Louisiana. The store-bought varieties are different because oftentimes if you go to, I know you don't have Rouse's in Pensacola, but there's, the Louisiana chain Rouse's will even have them advertised as Mirliton, Mobile, or even in Louisiana. But if you look on them, they're actually a product of Mexico or Puerto Rico. And so those are the different varieties, and they tend to grow 4,000 feet on mountainsides. And those don't tend to really flower until November. And so that is what the kind that I had planted with my first attempt. So that's the problem, as you know, because anybody who's done enough gardening knows if you don't start flowering and these, you don't start getting fruit to come out until the mid to late November, you risk freeze coming and killing any opportunity you have for fruit. So they're started from a single seed. Now, the Mirliton being pear-shaped, when you cut it in half, there's a single seed in there, kind of a flat seed. And you don't extract that. What you do is you let that sprout. It'll drop and it'll sprout, and it'll form roots that come out of that. And so it feeds off the plant that emerges from it is actually going to feed off of the nutrients in that particular fruit. And so that sustains it as the root system grows. And a lot of the old timers, they would just take them and put them in like a brown paper bag and put them someplace cool and then plant them in the spring. But due to some of the work that Mirliton.org did and some of the best practices they learned, it was actually better to put them in a pot, like a 3-gallon pot with a mixture. It's not organic, but it's potting soil and some perlite, a 2/3 to 1/3 ratio, to have some really well-drained soil in a pot that would allow root development to occur. But you can do the same with a good organic potting soil as well that drains well. The key is that you would want to water it, but only once a month, because you don't want to subject it to the possibility of rotting the fruit and the potential roots that come out of it. So here's a mature Mirliton that has been on the vine. And what you'll see is this single seed will start to actually drop out of the bottom. So what happens too, from a culinary standpoint, is that the internals tend to kind of get a little more fibrous. So you can still eat this one, but it's going to be a little tough. And then what I'll do is I'll put those up underneath in a paper bag or newspaper and kind of hide it under a cool, dark spot. And what you'll get is this sprout that emerges, kind of looks like an arm coming out, kind of creepy. And then what I'll do is I'll take that, and I actually got a small one here, but what will happen is you'll plant it, and you plant the bottom kind of like the bottom side down into the dirt. and you keep the top portion coming out. And what will happen is that little sprout comes out and it'll form these vines that you see here. So I made a practice of trying to save at least 3 for myself, just as an insurance policy, because since they're so hard to come by, even though all the best laid plans of trying to keep them around, there is always a possibility something could happen to them and they could die. But if I've at least tried to plan ahead and I'm fortunate enough, I'll have 3. And if I don't need them, I can give them to somebody or sell them. But as you can see, once these start to grow, they'll start to put on leaves, try to keep them off the ground. Some people will talk about letting them go 2 or 3 feet and then pinching them. And I did that one time. And those of you who might follow Plain Gardening with Bill Finch here in Mobile, I was talking to him about it, and Bill said, why would you do that? Because, you know, if you start cutting all these leaves off, you start cutting off its supply of food. So despite what some people recommend doing, I decided it would just be better to go ahead and just simply, I'll let it get as long as possible and just try to keep it wrangled in there around the bamboo. So hold on, let me go back. So once it gets past the frost, early frost of the new year, sometime late March, early April, what you'll want to do is find a location that's got partial sun or shade. I find that works best, and maybe 6 to 8 hours of sunlight, and plenty of room to grow, as we've already talked about the expansiveness of the vine. And you want to find you don't have to have a location that's easy to monitor, but it just helps, as y'all all know, to, you know, when you're able to go out and see it every day, it's easier to check on things and get ahead of problems. So the soil needs to be, you know, very well drained. Sandy, loamy soil works best with rich organic matter. pH is between a 6 and a 6.8. What you'll want to do is you'll want to prep a spot that's about a 12-foot diameter. Doesn't have to be real deep, just kind of get some garden tines in there and turn the soil over. And you want to mix in some organic mulch and things that really, some traits that some successful Mirliton growers have noticed is that if they raise rabbits or have access to rabbit droppings, Mirliton really like that as a fertilizer. So if you have that to mix in with that initial planting area, you'd want to go ahead and do that. You'd plant the plant. By this time, you should get a pretty good root ball going, and you plant it, and you want to have it trellised. And you would just kind of want to let it be able to grow up and out. What we also found is that you want to be maybe 30 to 40 feet away from something like a big pecan tree or an oak tree. Mine's underneath an old oak tree. That's partially for a couple of things. You get the partial shade, but then as those bigger trees, you know, are constantly pulling from the soil, you also maintain not having too much of a saturated ground around there. The trellis, traditionally, you saw what I had built. That makes it easy to walk up underneath and just pull the Mirliton down that are hanging, as well as help with vines. But often in Louisiana, you'd see them on like the old laundry T-poles growing in between, or even on just chain link fence. So oftentimes they'll be growing along somebody's fence and going into the neighbor's yard. So oftentimes neighbors get to share with each other from one person's vine because it makes so much. As far as fertilizing goes, I really don't do much fertilizing to it. I will put like the last couple of years, I really started just using like a bag of the rabbit droppings. My kids have a couple of pet rabbits inside, so my wife will scrape up their contributions, and I'll put those in the yard around the Mirliton plant about once a month. I have put in a liquid fertilizer maybe once if it looks like things are kind of a little weak after the summertime, but for the most part, it doesn't require a whole lot in my yard. So if you got good mulch, you should be in pretty good shape. What some of the battles that new growers find is that when you get to August, that the summer heat from in the August sun will tend to scorch the plants and really kind of kill them if they're not protected. So what will happen is they'll start to wilt, and the growers will start to overwater them or over fertilize them. And what we found is if you just put a simple shade cloth up, just a little structure that'll block just a regular sheet, it'll get you through that late July and early September timeframe and really help protect the plant, especially in that first year. Some people have tried to grow them in raised beds, but it's possible if you have a large enough raised bed that's well drained. But oftentimes what I've seen is that when people have tried it, they tend to hold too much water and you end up killing the plant with the root rot. Some people have reported that the biggest disease you might see with it is anthracnose. You start getting the browning of the leaves and the drying up from, I guess, the rain and the water bouncing off the ground and the bacteria. But what Mirliton.org has found over time is that if you get the heirloom varieties, they're a little more hardy for that kind of condition. Plus, by trellising them and putting them in well-drained areas, you minimize the opportunities for that to happen and get on the plants themselves. Of course, good spacing allows good airflow around it as well. So I haven't really experienced too much of that with my plant of 11 years. As far as pests goes, you might see some of the little beetles that look like the ladybugs. This year I experienced something I've never seen in 11 years. I was having massive defoliation for a couple of weeks, and come to find out, it looked like we had a cabbage looper getting on there and just decimating my leaves. So I took some precautions there. The young fruit around the end of the summer, you'll start seeing the juvenile leaf-footed stink bugs coming out, which can, as you know, what they do to tomatoes, they'll do the same thing to your Mirliton plants. And then the other big problem is really squirrels. At least in my yard, there's squirrels. And so you can either physically remove all these different, if you're vigilant enough, physically remove them, use insecticidal soaps. I used BT spray. I'm not sure if that's really considered organic, but it worked well on the cabbage looper.
It is organic.
Okay. I was reading, I couldn't tell whether from some of the sources I read, whether they considered that organic or not. But when it happened recently, that's when all the blooms were coming on. So I really didn't want to use anything that was going to do any problems to the insects that come around, because I get a lot of bees that come around with it. But as far as like the squirrels, the thing that really has worked well is a motion activated sprinkler on a tripod. And I've kind of actually beefed mine up a little bit, so I get another 2 foot by putting some 2-inch PVC poles up underneath the tripod to get some height and distance. So it's helped from keeping the squirrels away. The squirrels will start chewing on the new growth. And when they do that, the plant doesn't grow very much. So it really kind of, it's a battle every day, every year with the insects and the other pests. And as far as watering goes, Mobile being the rainiest city in America, as it's reported, I really don't do any watering for mine. I will in some of the years where we have a drought or the water table's down, but for the most part, I'm in West Mobile, so I'm a little higher up than down by the bay, but I really haven't had to do too much extra watering. But I'm imagining Pensacola gets the same rain patterns for the most part that we would get. So I really think that the same sort of tips that we do in Mobile would work in Pensacola. So once you successfully have gotten through the summer, around September 21st, you'll see a lot of new growth on the sprouts, but you'll also start seeing little clusters of blossom or blooms where flowers will come out. And like we talked about with the squash, it has male flowers and female flowers. And the male flowers will come out typically first. And oftentimes they'll be inundated with those. And then it'll be like 2 or 3 weeks. And then you'll start to see the female flowers with the little immature fruit on the end. I've gotten in the habit of hand pollinating them over the years because they're pretty easy to do, because just grabbing the male flower and going to the female flower. But I do that for a couple of reasons. One, because it's easy. And then also with it being toward the end of the summer, we've talked with Mirliton.org that, the abundance of pollinating insects may not be as great. So doing everything I can to protect these heirlooms, I'll go out of my way to try to make sure I can try to get these going. So what you'll see is that the immature fruits will start to be pollinated. In about 3 weeks, you'll end up having a mature Mirliton that you can pick, and it's ready to eat. And you'll end up in the first year maybe getting 30 to 40 off of a vine. And after several years, or after a couple of years, you actually get over 100. I think my best year with the plant here, I might have gotten 108 or 120, something like that. And then once again, you get a spring crop from an established plant. Now, the other practice is that because it's a perennial, what the old timers told me to do is that when you get the first frost, go ahead and cut the plant back, cut the vine back, which is always a painful thing for me to do after I've taken care of it so long, but I'll cut it back to about 2 inches, and I'll cover it with straw or hay and some cloth, and I'll just kind of leave it there. I'll check on it. But what you'll find is that after about mid-February to late February, you'll start checking down there and you'll start to see new shoots coming up. And once we get to a point where it's a little more moderate temperatures, I'll remove those and let it just start to grow back up the trellis. So like, as you can tell, since I've got an 11-year-old vine, I've been successful with at least one of them doing well. There's probably, if you go on the internet and you look, especially with Louisiana heirloom vegetable growing, or not so much heirloom, but Louisiana vegetable growing, there's a lot of myths that people have passed down either through their grandparents or the parents, that you need a male or female fruit or a male or female plant. But as you know, as we said, all the fruits are really females because they get pollinated and they hold the seed. But as we talked about, the vine itself has both male and female flowers on it. So you really just need one vine. You don't need two. But as we try to point out, of course, if you have what you think are a male and female, and you got two plants, well, you've just increased your chances of better pollination because you got two plants with twice as many flowers, hopefully. So try to be real delicate when explaining that to people, that there are no such things as male and female plants or fruits. So that's really the kind of the basics on growing it. I was going to touch a little bit quickly on Mirliton.org. So as Elizabeth was talking about, Mirliton have been growing in the Louisiana area for a while. After Katrina, we all know what happened there. We ended up with a lot of flooding, and a lot of the heirloom vines around New Orleans got flooded, and a lot of the well-established vines actually ended up dying. And so what ended up happening in New Orleans and Plaquemine Parish is that a lot of the growers would tend to went to the grocery store, got the chayotes and planted them, and came to the realization that they weren't the same species and varieties that they were planting. And they realized that in order to be successful, they needed to locate Louisiana heirlooms. So this became a passion of a gentleman named Dr. Lance Hill, who was a former professor at Tulane University. You can see here, he founded the Southern Institute of Education and Research. And he really got in. He's a Kansas native, but when he first moved to New Orleans, he was greeted by neighbors sharing with him the bounty of the Mirliton. And so it became a favorite and a staple of his. So what ended up happening is that, he became really concerned. He's been an advocate for a lot of things in the city. And so it spurred him to form this nonprofit organization, which became Mirliton.org. And he worked with the farmers market, Crescent City Farmers Market in New Orleans, and created a program called Adopt a Mirliton. And what they did is they scoured the environment around New Orleans to the areas that weren't as hard hit by Katrina. And they found at least about 9 heirloom varieties that they were able to bring back, start, and they would let the people come to the farmers market, plant them. And with the plan was that they give half of them back for others to plant, and they get to keep half of them. And in a couple of years, they were able to kind of repopulate a lot of heirloom varieties around the city. He's this website, which I'll show you how to get to in a little bit, is a great resource, better than some of the state colleges or the state college there with regard to information on growing the Mirliton. He's got well-written articles, blog posts on growing, pest control, histories, and he's been collecting a lot of international recipes because, chayote and with the various names, it grows in many countries. So many cultures enjoy it for the different type of recipes, whether it's Asian, Latin American. I had a gentleman from Germany contact me. He was growing it there. Dr. Hill he formed this nonprofit and he's enlisted the help of others. Mr. Paul Dana and Metairie, who will grow them and disperse them. Another fellow, James Cobb in Homa, who grows them. Renee Laparuliu, a woman from the Tremay area who's been growing it. Chef John Fulse, if you're familiar with some Louisiana culinary names, he's been real passionate about it. And of course, then there's me, yours truly. So we kind of formed the little network and nucleus of trying to preserve this with mirliton.org. We've got various projects. Like I said, he's been naming them. I won't really go into it unless somebody has a question on this Israel Thibodeau, but the white Mirliton we saw earlier was named after a gentleman named Israel Thibodeau who grew them in Opelousas. Many of the names that if you go to mirliton.org that you'll see the varieties, they were named after the person who really was kind of the caretaker when Dr. Hill found them. Like I said, you'll find blogs. I've been writing a couple for him recently on Mirliton pioneers, where I've been looking at folks that grew them in the area. So I go back to the 1930s and 40s and find some interesting facts about them. He's got an exhaustive collection of international recipes. And then what's really kind of where a lot of people find interest is the classified, because that's where you will find how to get an heirloom Louisiana Mirliton, the plant. We'll end up purchasing some from local growers, and Mr. Paul will plant them and start them in pots. And that's how Elizabeth got a lot of hers. And he makes those accessible, and we'll advertise that these are available for those who are looking to get a true Louisiana heirloom, and to hopefully ensure success that they will be able to plant them in their own properties. So you can tell I'm kind of coming toward the end. I've got a YouTube channel where I've been documenting my weekly, video diary of growing my Mirliton for the last 3 years. I'm on week 5 now. It's under just David J. Hubbell. I'll show you that in a minute. On Facebook, I created Mirliton Man in Mobile. Dr. Hill was known, or is known, as the Mirliton Man, but for a little while, there took a little bit of a hiatus. So I kind of borrowed the name, but I tried to throw the distinction on there of it being in Mobile, so not to confuse the two. And I also have a little cottage food company where I do some stuff with Mirliton. And then if you want to send me an email with some questions, you can just send it to rpcajun2r@gmail.com. And to kind of finish off, go ahead.
Just to let you know, David, I have been putting mirliton.org is on there, your YouTube channel, your email address. So it's easy just to copy and paste from the chat.
Okay. So just to finish off, I thought I'd give a little inspiration on what you can do with Mirliton. So after you've gone through all this, this effort of growing them, how do you cook them? So they can be used, they're pretty versatile in soups, gumbos, au gratins. You can stuff them back in the shell, make casseroles. Some cultures will actually eat the shoots or the roots. Every part of it's pretty edible. And there's a lot of Asian and Latin recipes. But I figured I would kind of show you, this is a cream and Mirliton soup with shrimp. This is a Mirliton gumbo recipe from New Orleans chef Austin Leslie. Mirliton au gratin. And this is stuffed Mirliton, the white Israel Thibodeau's stuffed with crab meat and shrimp. This is just a more stuffed Mirliton with shrimp. And this is a shrimp casserole, Mirliton shrimp casserole that usually I make at Christmas. So I actually made all these. So those are all my photos there. So that's it for the presentation, unless you want me to show you any of the websites. But Elizabeth, if you think the links are there, we don't really need to do that.
Yeah.
So
Thank
that's,
you.
I hope that wasn't too fast, and I hope that was informative enough.
It was incredibly informative. Does
Okay.
anybody have any, well, I was asking if anybody has questions. I have questions.
Go ahead.
How long will a Mirliton fruit last before it starts to rot? Like, how long can you store them?
Okay. I've kept them, I put them in the refrigerator. Dr. Hill says not to put them in the refrigerator, but a lot of times you can keep them on the shelf on the counter, kind of like a potato, for a couple of weeks. What'll happen is, like the one that you saw, that'll get kind of wrinkly, and it'll have the seed will start to drop. They'll just get a little tougher. I mean, they won't really rot real bad. So you can probably keep them 4 to 6 weeks. They just won't be as young and vibrant looking, the longer you go.
Yeah. Okay. And my next question is, do you know anyone who is trying to grow Mirliton with trying to contain how long it gets? Like, is anybody trying to, I can't think of the word now, to pinch it back or whatever, so that it's not 100 feet long, but
Kind of
like,
make it more bushy.
yeah, something that the average person can grow in their backyard, because that's a big plant.
Yeah. Well, what happens is that where you're going to get a lot of the fruiting is going to occur at the new growth spots. And so as you can see with the one behind me, in fact, one of the old articles I looked at, one of the gentlemen actually used it made an arbor with it, because it's so thick and it had so much covering. So you can kind of get it to bush out, and you might be able to actually kind of contain the length, but you may want to let it kind of grow out. So maybe you don't have it as long, but you may have it just kind of more square. Maybe, I don't know if you kind of get it into my area was like 20, like I said, roughly 10 by 20 is you could probably be successful with that. And, but as far as that, sometimes just because of the squirrels and nature itself, they don't always get as long as 100 feet. So I think, you probably,
but even 30 feet is a big plant.
yeah. Sometimes I'm looping it back on top of itself, and just kind of letting it build up. Now, the one that we did the first year at my dad's, that really was more like a 10 by 10 area. So it was kind of just sprawled out on the ground. We had it on a couple of sawhorses, but from that standpoint, I think you'd still be successful. You probably just would limit the amount. If you only want to get 30 to 50 as opposed to 100, that may be the biggest detriment there.
Yeah. Okay. Well, thank you.
Okay.
Who else has a question?
See, there's a lot in the chat.
Yeah,
there's a
there's a
bunch of
lot
stuff.
of thanks. And then Andrea asked about peeling them, but I think I answered that. It just depends.
Yeah. Well, that's a good question. Because I posted something else you did the other day, but when you cook it, you can do two things. You can eat it. If people who eat it raw, you can peel it. And that is a really good question, because, and maybe you answered this part, Elizabeth, there's kind of a sticky substance that is, it lets out. And so it's almost like some people describe it kind of gluey. And so you can peel it with a potato peeler, and you got to constantly kind of wash your hands, because it has just that really sticky substance. But most of the time when people cook it, what you'll do is you'll either boil it whole or cut it in half and boil it 20 to 40 minutes like a potato until it's soft. Just, you can insert a knife, and then you'll take it out, cool it. And then oftentimes you just kind of scrape out the pulp and either make a casserole and put it back in the shell, or just take it out and just use it in, like I say, in the soup and puree it.
So, yeah. And then sometimes I've found last year, some of the teeny ones, the babies, I mean, we just had so many extra, I was just eating them. I mean, I just ate them because they were real little, and it was getting cold and I had a bunch. But David, we have another question from Sylvia. Are they salt spray tolerant? She's on the bay.
I don't know. I'm trying to think of most of the areas that have had them are either like off the Mississippi River, or I'm trying to think, obviously some Plaquemine Parish, you get a little further down, you can get closer to some of that, but I don't know. Honestly, I'll have to find out. I'm sitting here thinking, and I really don't have an answer. So I don't want to tell you it can't be done. But the leaves they're pretty pliable. What really tends to dry them out is when you get like just below 50 degrees in the 40s, they'll almost get kind of papery. And so that'll dry it out. So I don't know if maybe the sea spray would cause sort of the same effects, but I'll check. Maybe Dr. Hill might know.
All right. Anyone else?
Thank you so much. You have lots of thanks, lots of wonderful presentations, learned a lot. So yeah, thank you so much, David, for joining us.
Oh, you're welcome. Like I said, all the places that you've listed them, my YouTube page has plenty of recipes on there that actually show how to make the things that I had shown pictures of. Dr. Hill as well has the international recipes in there. The Mirliton.org tells you how to grow it, the projects we have on preserving the Israel Thibodeau white Mirliton, because we almost lost that. So we got preservation projects going. If you follow me on the Facebook page or reach out to me on my email address, if you're interested in trying to grow them, we'll at least put you on the list. And hopefully if we have a successful year like last year, you can either get them from New Orleans, myself, or hopefully maybe Elizabeth will have a few that she can provide for folks.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And then Diana, I wanted to check in with you. The one that you're growing, is that the chayote that we had last year, or did you buy new ones, or what do you got over there?
The one that you had given me last year.
Yeah, so that was one of the leftover ones from the chayote. So what I kind of wonder is if you have this established chayote population and then you grow them, will they adapt to this climate, or will they still be coming up north, South America kind of late? So
that's a good question. I don't know. One thing what we found is that even though we try to encourage just growing the heirloom varieties, what will happen is that you get a mild winter and you get maybe one of the varieties of chayotes that tend to, they kind of adapt and they make it through. And so you do get some. And I assume that that's sort of what happened with the varieties that were originally in Louisiana, is maybe they adapted enough over a couple of generations to where they did well and were more accustomed to what the Gulf Coast was offering temperature wise. But I don't know if we have enough documentation to really prove that. So the only other thing is that there's some concern about cross-pollination. I've heard comments from both with the white Mirliton project we got. I try to dissuade anybody from trying to grow both that and the green, because I don't know if it's going to cross-pollinate, and just want to try to keep those individual varieties as pure as possible, just to keep them going. So the other concern is with the Latin American chayotes. Are you going to have a cross-pollination issue that's going to kind of end up actually causing more of a concern, where we lose the heirlooms even more than losing them on their own? There's probably been so many that have been lost just to what's happened now is that a lot of the older growers were in their 80s, and their children or grandchildren didn't care about them, things like the storms and all. And so you end up with losing a lot of that. So that's kind of what we've really been trying to do, is just try to preserve that for future generations, and hopefully introduce that and keep it on on the Gulf Coast plates, so that people will be interested in keeping it going.
Well, good. Well, you guys are doing a fantastic job keeping it out in front of people and getting them interested in growing it themselves. So thank you so much for your presentation. I was so glad to have you come on, and Elizabeth, thank you for thinking of it and for bringing David to us so that we can learn from him.
I appreciate the opportunity. This is actually the first Mirliton presentation I've made. So if you have any suggestions on things to do
you did
better
good.
or different,
Yeah, it was great.
Because I think Dr. Hill would like us to do a little bit more. So I think I got a podcast interview I'll be doing this week also. So maybe we'll start making the Mirliton circuit or something like that with talks.
Wonderful. All right. Well,
thank you.